Exciting to segue from discussions of the city to the discussion of cinema, secondly. And thirdly, I thought some issues which came out quite prominently this morning would be issues of critical methodologies which have been suggested, which are being suggested by design. So I'll very quickly underline these three things. Now let's go back to the city again. I think we can make this distinction, which was suggested by Diana Aggres, who was going to come but who couldn't make it, when she said, it's one thing to think about the city from the point of view of architecture, and something very different to think about architecture from the point of view of the city. If you think about the city from the point of view of architecture, then architecture becomes objects and icons standing for the city. Right? This is what, in short, would be the Bilbao effect. Right? So you identify the city with the architecture that's in it. So you know that would be seeing the city from the point of view of architecture. Right? Now the other way would be to see architecture from the point of view of the city would be to see architecture itself as something that has to be understood in relationship to the space around it. Right? And the space around it would include socio-economic, political, affective, blah, blah, blah. Right? So it's all this space in relationship to which buildings and other things and design, all that would make sense. And this distinction, I think, would lead us to very different kinds of design issues. Like, for example, what Leo was talking about last night, what he calls the Jinmao edifice complex versus the practice of an architect like Wang Shuo, or Zhang Yonghe's position, which is, I think, a kind of double and ambiguous one, where what we see on the one hand is a kind of realistic acknowledgement, right, of the inevitability of the disappearing city. The way in which economics and so on and so forth would make the disappearing city inevitable. And at the same time, his attempt to preserve not so much the material city, not so much, shall we say, the literal content of the material city, which in a way is impossible to do as he sees it, not to embalm, as it were, the city, but to preserve through new forms and materials the valuable experiences of the city and the valuable aspects of the urban fabric. Right? This, it seems to me, was this double project that Yonghe was doing. And Yonghe also intimates, and this is an issue that's been circulating, I think, that the city is in a way everywhere, no matter where you place it. I mean, you might place the city in a country, you might place a building in a countryside. There is still a kind of city space that surrounds it. And I mean, one example that might underline that is, think about the suburbs in a David Lynch film, right? Where, as we know, the most horrendous things associated with the inner city happen. Right, so what do we have there now? I mean, in David Lynch's suburbs. It's not the suburbs, it's not urbanism, it's not suburbanism, it's a kind of new form that we don't have a name for yet. And this has been called by Mauro Gandolsonis, whom we also invited to come, and he was sick, he couldn't make it, what he provisionally called the X-urban, right? X-urbanism. And X here, X as in the X-Files, right? X in the sense of the unknown part of an equation, or X as that which marks the scene of a crime. I mean, this is what you get in so it's as if, you know, David Lynch for urbanism is probably today much more important a person than Kevin Lynch. Let me make one quick note on Koolhaas, and you might say for the last time, Ram Koolhaas. You see, I think the thing about Koolhaas is that he's not just a very good architect, but also, to a certain extent, a really good writer. Not only is he a good writer, he's a very different kind of writer. I think that the sort of writing that you see in Koolhaas is really a different genre of writing. And I would like to begin by saying that I think Koolhaas's architecture cannot be lumped together with the Jinmao building, for example, right? I also don't think that the CCTV building, whatever you think about it, is a Nazi structure, right? Now, Jinmao, if you go back to that, Jinmao has, of course, gone beyond the doctrine of less is more, right? It's more going towards this idea of less is a bore. And hence, because of this, the buildings like this are re-sanctioning the importance of narrative, of symbol, of identity, right? Cultural identity as an important part of what a building is, which, of course, unfortunately, in the Asian context, could also produce the Orientalist arguments, right, of something like Jinmao architecture, the pagoda and all that kitschy stuff. Now, in the light of this, I think we can make 2 points about Koolhaas. I want to make this point. Firstly, the point about what Koolhaas calls the generic city, because whenever this term is invoked in relationship to Koolhaas, it is more often misunderstood than not, right? Because in Koolhaas, when Koolhaas talks about the generic in the generic city, the generic does not imply the loss of identity. It doesn't imply the absence of identity. It doesn't imply homogeneity or anything like that, which is how what we think of as a generic. What it implies is the liberation from identity. And the slogan that he gives us in this essay in generic is down with identity, right? Down with identity is like a kind of modernist slogan equivalent to the Dadaist saying something like down with moonlight. So, I mean, there's that part. And what you have, therefore, is a liberation from identity, but also a liberation from all this Orientalist claptrap, right? So, for example, when you build a building in China, I mean, all this Orientalist stuff about Chinese identity, you can put aside. But then, of course, what happens that what you have in would be the plonking down of sort of architectural fantasies now in the junk space or the unregulated space of China. Now, one second point about Koolhaas is that, and this is mentioned, as you know, the part of this complex related to CCTV, the hotel, was burned down, right? Now, the interesting thing is that when it was burned down, the Beijing reaction to that was one of glee. I mean, people didn't say, oh, what a pity. I mean, it's not like, you know, the World Trade Center burning down. I mean, it was one of glee. Ha ha, you know. Basically, that sort of thing. And I mean, we can speculate on why that is so, but it's certainly not simply an example of like, you know, urban indifference, you know, like New York seeing people lying on the ground and walking around. Nothing to do with that, right? It's something completely different, right? And I think it might have something to do with, like what Latour was telling us about. I mean, one really good distinction I think Latour makes is this distinction between what he calls matters of fact and matters of concern, right? So what you have with these buildings in Shanghai and Beijing is that they are matters of fact, right? They do not address the concerns of the citizenry. Right? So when something that is an important part of the cityscape burns down, right, what has it got to do with me, right? It doesn't have anything to do with me as an ornery Beijing citizen. So it's another spectacle. So, I mean, that might be one way of looking at it. Right, so let me now quickly do this segue to cinema, which is what we did yesterday. Now, one of the first things to say is that, of course, with cinema, the image comes in now in a more prominent way. And also the visual comes back in a kind of, in a different way. Right? Because you could use the visual in cinema to undercut visuality, much more so than you can do in architecture. And I usually say here that, and I don't want to explain this now, right? That contrary to a huge misunderstanding, cinema is not a visual medium. Don't ask me to explain that now. So that's one thing would be about the image and the different take on it. A second thing would be that there's a different take on issues of affectivity and space. Now, these two terms have been used a lot also, right? Affect, space. Are they just pretentious synonyms for place and emotion? I mean, why don't we say emotion? Why do we say affect? Right? Why don't we just use well, I think there might be a reason for this. And we can say a reason with something like this. Affect are emotions which are intense, but which we don't have a name for yet. Right? There are emotions for which we don't have names yet for yet. So it's like things are circulating, things are happening. You know it's important, you feel it, but you can't say what it is. It's not jealousy, right? It's not hatred, right? It's something intense for which you have no name. You call that affect. Now, space, I think, could also be understood to a certain extent in this way, right? A space are places for which we don't have names yet. I mean, there isn't a kind of, ironclad distinction between that. One shades into the other, right? But place is, of course, what we inhabit, where we live, and so on and so forth. But it's also surrounded by a kind of penumbra of non-understanding, right? And I think it's useful maybe to think of that as space. And therefore, if you look at the film yesterday, one of the things that you see, one of the things that was interesting about it is that it's really a kind of attempt to put before us an image of an affective space, right? It's an affective space that you're seeing here. And it does it by showing us the Xiaoyuan, which is the most traditional of Beijing structures. But it's a Xiaoyuan that has, as we said earlier on, lost its coordinates, right? It's not just a traditional building. It's more like this other thing that we call any space whatever, right? It's there, but then the way you understand it is completely different. I mean, the sort of things that happen in the Xiaoyuan, it's not like what, for example, Zhang Yonghe showed us, when he showed us a picture of people living in Xiaoyuans, even though it's a new one, right? People looking after the bird and bird cages, right? I mean, nothing of this happens in perpetual motion, right? What you get there are, of course, these new phantasmagorias of the interior, right? To use this Benjamin's phrase. Huh? I mean, that's what you're getting, right? The new phantasmagorias of the interior. Now, another point would be this. I think that space and affectivity here can also not just be understood in terms of symptoms. They're not just symptoms of each other, right? So a certain affect would be a symptom of a certain kind of space. If they are symptoms, they would have to be understood in terms of what we might call the hysterical symptom. Now, what is a hysterical symptom? And you could contrast it to an organic symptom. Organic symptom is if you eat something unclean, you have a stomach ache, right? The stomach ache is directly related to something. Now, with a hysterical symptom, if you feel or if something wrong with you, this something wrong can be manifested either as blindness or as hard of hearing, right? Or as muteness and so on and so on. The symptom travels, right? It's not fixed and it's not directly linked to some, and that's what the hysterical here would be. And of course, the film, as you remember, ended on this hysterical note, right? As we said, there were these two climaxes. One, this clear-cut climax, right? Who did it? You know, who is the adulteress? That one. And then, of course, the other one, the hysterical laughter, right? I mean, one could be expressed as tears, right? Emotion, right? My lover has died, blah, 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 right? So tears. The other one is like this crazy laughter, which can mean anything, right? Which go in any way. Now, and I'd like to very quickly sort of go from there to the issue of design methodologies that this might be raising, which I think was what the last seminar was about. I mean, this whole question of motion. And I was going to sort of introduce some discord between Achille and Sarah. Because what Sarah started by saying, which I thought was very interesting, was when she proposed that we should take surfaces, right? Surfaces as a space of analysis, right? A little bit like Edgar Allan Poe and the philosophy of furniture, right? The things that are there and how you might analyze it. Achille gave us this other thing to begin with, which is what it calls the stylization of cityscape as indicative of the movement of capital. Or I would paraphrase that as the skyline reflecting the bottom line. But then, this is the last point. And then, but of course, where they come to a certain extent to some way in which the issues might be engaged would possibly be in this notion of lines of flight, the Deleuzean idea, which in terms of cinema and movement that we've been talking about, this segue into cinema, is actually a question of motion and emotion, right, which would be the affectivity part, right? Motion and emotion, and which means, of course, that analysis, like of design and culture, would not see design simply as a metaphor for what the state of culture is. We need something more than metaphor. You need other ways of thinking, which might, for example, focus on, let's say, serial structures, right? Where it's no longer relationship between this and that on a vertical level, but on a kind of seriality where the substance is in the way in which the surface moves and develops, right? And of course, in notions like repetition, right? What repetition means and where repetition takes us and so forth, right? Okay, so that's another brief summary, and we'll be doing this sort of from time to time.
Ackbar will pay for therapy afterwards. Achille and Sarah, can you come up here? And we're going to take, I mean, you can, as you look like you're fixed, so you can stay. Right. We're going to take comments, questions, interventions from the various groups. So some of the groups are sitting together. Maybe you can just intervene from where you are. Ready, steady, go. A spokesperson, representative, yeah, Bhaskar. There you go.
I'm speaking on behalf of Group F. We talked a lot about this very provocative, the ways in which the idea of decadence was pushed and elaborated today, and I'm particularly referring to Achille's formulation that decadence is kind of discernible through a chain of substitutions, and we need to kind of unhinge the concept from its archaic understanding of being associated with certain kinds of moral values which are already givens. But we kind of, in our discussion, tried to think through this and came up with the idea that maybe that doesn't mean an absence of values altogether, because we can still have economic evaluation, we can still have political evaluation. So, for instance, having a lot of apartments lying empty in big cities when there is acute overpopulation and problem of housing is a form of both economic waste in some ways, and also produces certain kinds of political inequities that are really glaring. Then we talked about the relationship of decadence to style, which also Achille, I think, brought up. And we were wondering if then we could think about decadence as perhaps a performance of excess. For instance, the Jinmao Tower, we could think of it as a national and urban phallus, which has its own kind of productivities, but it also has certain kinds of negative externalities. So, the stylization of the urban space, what kind of decadence it produces. Then we talked about the relationship of decadence to production of desire and happiness, not just as givens, but to think of what makes me happy or what makes me, what I want, what I desire. Those things seem to be changing over time. And I was thinking, in fact, of a pun set, not so much a concept. The decade in decadence. You know, we often think about, oh, that is so 90s, and dismiss it in that way. So that keeps changing, and that itself seems to be a way to think about, I think what Ashil means by decadence, this sort of constant movement through substitution, this constant production of desire.
Anybody else from that group want to add?
Maybe taking from the last part of what Ackbar was talking, that in a way we felt that temporality has to come into the the debate, because in order, let's say, to evaluate the Jinmao, it's not the same if you think of the Jinmao kind of today, or if you think of the Jinmao in a kind of how will be, or what this identity will be in 20 years. This kind of stylization of the city, which kind of lifespan does it have?
So we discussed what Sarah said in her remarks about translating Shanghai in a way that could be applicable to different cities, and we talked about what that translation might entail. We also talked about the upsides and downsides of this sort of new model. And then we also discussed the provocative question of what have you encountered in Shanghai that hasn't been theorized, what can't be theorized. And then someone brought up a comment about space as a cultural production. How do different spaces inspire different kinds of design, and how might Shanghai contrast with a place like New Orleans, which to some is not considered an artificial design. After Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans looked more like art than reality, and how does that change our concept of design? And finally, someone brought up comments about space and time as topics to discuss more.
So we started by talking about differences. We knew that the discussion was centering around developing a critical methodology that would both engage with the particularity of Shanghai, but within a global context. So that's why we started by talking about difference, both the problem of translation in the group that is about language, but also about disciplinary differences between us, generational differences. We talked about geographical differences. Somebody said to talk about the Chinese city is ridiculous, since Chinese cities are so different in themselves. So it really came down to trying to be very specific about the particular. But then, of course, you're simply left with differences, which, if you're trying to develop a methodology, is not necessarily that useful. So then we moved on to talk about Sarah's challenge to study the city as an ideal. And so what does that mean? Do we want to start from the premise that the city is an idea? And we found that that's both an interesting provocation, but also somewhat problematic, and we're not sure how far that would get us in terms of developing a methodology that will challenge theory, or that will push theory. We talked about the need to develop a theoretical and methodological models that grow out of specific objects out of the process of being made. The city itself, we said, is maybe we shouldn't be thinking about the city, but we should be thinking about cities as networks of ideas, as processes of being made. So again, we came back to, all right, so we're talking about the city and movement again, about the particular, but how far does that get us in terms of developing a methodology? Do we actually have a language to address these particularities? And then we moved on to talk about the possibility of drawing on an ecological models, frameworks for studying movement and change. Wittgenstein has a very famous challenge to the notion that the world is in movement. You can never step into the same river twice, which is that you can always study riverbanks. So we started to think about riverbanks, ecological models, types of duration. There was the framework of the idea of recombinant urbanism, so that particularities are never simply particular, but belong to flows that are hybrid. I don't know, am I getting to what we talked about? And then we also discussed Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin as providing a really useful methodology for studying particularities and phenomenologies of place. We thought that the idea of surfaces is an interesting problematic for us, but also difficult. It's not necessarily that interesting to say that the Dubai airport looks like the Zurich airport, because where do you go from that? And that engaging with surfaces, the danger of that is that you just say superficial things. It might be more interesting to say that the cab drivers in Dubai get lost because they've just arrived there. Just to focus on particularities, we liked Leo Lee's anecdote about carrying the Walter Benjamin book through shopping malls, so that you take something that Walter Benjamin has become a global phenomenon, but that how Walter Benjamin gets taken up in particular sites is very, very interesting. It's probably me that's forcing it, but I think there needs to be a discussion, as the previous group pointed out, of space-time relationships, of images and how images engage with architecture. We might go back to people like Siegfried Gideon, who understood in the 30s that if you're studying buildings, you also have to study all the spaces around those buildings, and the spaces around those buildings include images, and images include the imagination. So I think that's it.
Okay, I'm not sure if I can sum up everything, but I think the first half was they talk about actually about translation, and also the way to find some way to talk about to break down the dichotomy. But in any case, I'm not the best person to do this, but anyway, I sort of at the end we talk about the question of surgings and decaying, and there was a suggestion that one way to think about it in the material level was we're thinking about American cities these days is decaying. Troy, for instance, that image, right, and then China's being the city that is surging. But there's another way to talk about decaying and surging is also thinking, just look at Chinese cities, that the political economy of capitalism actually require all this build space to decay very quickly so that they can rebuild. And then decaying become the necessities of surgings. And someone suggested an image, perhaps we can, for people who have been to the City Planning Museum in Shanghai, if you go to near the top floor, there's a huge model of the city of Shanghai. It's really gigantic, several times of this room with all the buildings and basically the model of the city. It was sort of the first moment you walk into this hold is sort of shock and awe because the dramatic lighting and so forth. But at the same time, if you actually look closer to the actual model, very quickly you realize that the model itself is decaying. There's dust everywhere, and part of it is falling apart. So it's kind of interesting image. We have to sum up this sort of the dichotomy of it, because if they can't even maintain the model itself, right? The question is what would be the cost to maintain the city that they're building? So I think that again, I'm not sure I can sum up everything, but that's one aspect of the discussion.
Well, we are in the same group. I think one problem we have discussed of design is that it's so difficult to talk about design with our language. Well, it can be an English problem. It's just a Chan, his speech to translate. It's so difficult to translate. But partly because it's English, or partly because it's a spatial setting environment. We talk about design in a seminar room that we just sit here to imagine those architecture outside. We don't really feel it. We cannot really see the material, the details of those things. So it can be a difficulty. But another difficulty is how this relates to the question: how should we use a kind of Western theory concept to understand Chinese design, this kind of thing? Well, we think, but because both I and Vicky come from New School of Social Research and Parsons School of Design, we deal with a lot of designer stuff. So probably one thing, the question is what we can. Well, the question is how do critical theories can learn from design? Well, probably one approach can be made is that we social scientists, theories, etc. We tend to read a lot. We tend to think a lot, but we do not make. And designers do make a lot. Well, probably one way to do theory is how to do theories in the spirit of making, in the spirit of collaboration. So probably that would be something that we can learn from designer and shift the angle a little bit.
I'll start off and then pass this to someone. But I guess we have some of the same questions I think Jason was raising about dismayed at what kind of ways that we're talking about design and how we're still a little bit unclear on how we might define it, and if we're all defining it in exactly the same way. Another interesting thing that came up was circularity of time and linearity of time in relationship to the idea of decay and decadence. And that's where I pass it.
Avoiding to speak. Well, I guess it's an extension of what I was trying to say yesterday, which is that perhaps there can be a psychoanalytic intervention in the concept of speed in terms of how we're thinking about building. And one of the things that we talked about in relationship to the concept of time is that what are we protecting in terms of a linear historical notion of time? And we talked a little bit about the proposition that the very concept of linear historical time is a repression of cyclical time of the drives. And the eating scene that Aaron brought up yesterday in the film, was very emblematic for us in terms of how that can be played out, especially since that scene was in slow motion. It actually formally rendered another order of time, and we thought that might be a way to talk about development a little bit differently. If I may, I actually just want to say one thing about affect, which is that affect is psychic presentation that is beside the notion of idea. And I think it's also very important to think of affect not just in terms of presence, but in terms of what it does psychically, namely that the representation of affect is an instrument for deception, for wish fulfillment, for doubleness. So I think that a critical hermeneutics of affect would necessitate thinking about all these things at once.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that we briefly talked about, and I think it comes back to a number of the group's discussion of decadence, and I guess one of the first problems, without like much critical reflection on the term, is that there's something negative about the term or something. And I think Group F was talking about how there's something also very productive about this, and I think it was Simon was talking about at length the work that probably many here know of Wu Heng talking about ruins and so forth. And the tendency to think about decay, but in thinking about contemporary cities, we were also thinking about the way in which even decay is at present being reworked in very productive ways. So one example that comes to mind is the Old Summer Palace in Beijing, right, which has served as a very certain type of ruin for a long time, and recently has been decided to be rebuilt. So I mean, this seemed one potential kind of example to get into this question of decadence. Yeah, I think.
Our group actually was focusing around some ideas coming off the film from yesterday, but I wanted to add some broader comments that we'd also been discussing before and after the group in regard to possibilities of theory. And I think that Sarah offered us a pretty important challenge in what I heard in opening up a conversation on, well, we're sort of at the point of, some important arenas of theoretical debate have been on the table for a while, post-colonial, postmodern, and there have been these kind of mixings and rearticulations, but maybe not if I've got it straight right. We haven't sort of renamed a new project. We have these mixings, and it's a kind of time to reflect on that. And where are we going, and what are some of the possibilities? And I find that very compelling. It's a very important challenge. And then we've kind of had this different debates crossing the tables over the last few days about something east-west, which I think I can say, and I know a number of other people have been resonating on this theme, that that's not where we want to be, that east-west thing. And the reason we don't want to be there is because a lot of that's been unpacked anyway in different academies globally, and also because we don't want to sort of reaffirm that particularly pernicious binary. But like getting into the Chinese academy, right, or echoing Said back to traveling theory, right, different theoretical projects move around the world, and they get reinterpreted and remade for particular local contexts and in reflection of particular kind of political projects. And this country has one, right? A particular kind of political national project. I mean, when we've heard this in the talks, especially by architect colleagues here and such, about, look, the country has a particular project in rebuilding China, and it's very much conjoined to a national programmatic outlook. And so that in that context, you can also look at particular theoretical debates that have moved through the Chinese academy, and even on the New Left, within the New Left, in which even like postmodern theory has a particular resonance in the Chinese academy that actually gets reformulated to reconstruct the West as an ongoing issue as China moves through its modernization and nationalization program, which is different than East-West, sort of China in the West. And so there are ways of talking about all these issues, but it gets more interesting, I think, if we get into the ways that these particular theoretical formulations have been interpreted and reinterpreted in particular intellectual contexts. And so we don't need to go back to the East-West thing, but one thing I sort of pulled up while I was trying to think about it, also a number of very interesting comments going through the debates about what is sort of the meaning of something called art, right? Art, design, right? These are all being re-problematized. And a number of people have been to the Guangzhou Triennials, which that triennial sort of bills itself as the most edgy cultural event in China, and the branding is, okay, separate, all right, I don't mean to underscore it. But one of the curators of that for the one last year, the third Guangzhou Triennial, in an essay in the exhibition catalog he wrote, this is the English translation, post-colonial discourse has anti-oppression connotations in the European and American intellectual world, but becomes an enemy of the cultural left in China. And so, you know, something like that has to be unpacked and sort of worked through. For some of these kind of theoretical comparisons to take place, or we just need to be cautious about what kind of theoretical sort of apparatus we're mapping onto what. And we can do it. I mean, it's entirely possible. But I think we do have to get into some of these comparative theoretical debates.
Any other comments from that group?
Can I say something about architecture? Sorry,
Yeah,
while I
sure.
have this. Because I tried to say something yesterday about why are we sort of recalling particular architects as arbiters of some of our interests. And I think I heard Achille respond to some of what I was trying to think about in terms of, well, are particular architects working for China, or are they sort of reinventing or even promoting themselves in the guise of China? And the reason I just wanted to bring that up again is to try to clarify a point, because in this arena, I think the debate is really interesting, but you also think about like where you go into urban studies or urban geography or some of these more social science arenas where some same issues are being worked out, but they're being worked out in less critical terms. And when those kind of, because a lot of contemporary architecture in the global economy represents itself in particular kinds of shorthand ways, right? Almost by branding slogans, right? This like Shenzhen speed is just one example. But when that shades over into these arenas of urban studies, urban geography, and urban planning, it gets accepted rather uncritically. And then it feeds right into the whole kind of creative industries, neoliberal city, entrepreneurial city apparatus in a very kind of particular way that is absent a kind of critical ethics. And that's why I get concerned about repeating it, because it takes on a very different political, maybe not even a nuance, but an acritical kind of traveling opportunity.
Something related that we discussed is the question Sarah posed in the morning, how to talk about a post-apartheid culture without constantly reinscribing trauma and the traumatic past and reinscribing the parameters of apartheid. And someone in the group asked how can we do this and then still deal with history, or how can we still trace history and memory and so on. And I read Sarah's intervention also as one a critique of a model that would be along the lines of an attachment to injury. We talked about two ways of revisiting the past. One that would be revisiting it in a way in which the roles remain fixed always between victims and perpetrators and apartheid, non-apartheid, so that the same issues, it's a kind of fixation to the past, versus another one is not only working through of the past, but also becoming sensitive how past issues and past injuries have taken on different lives in the present, and how in the present, even if you have traumatic memories, you are productively engaged in remaking history. And so from that on, we had a discussion about nostalgia and whether use of the courtyard was a fetishized courtyard, aesthetics and politics, and cities in Second Life, especially the RMB cities in Second Life, and the Second Life as replication rather than a completely wild play of fantasy. Yeah, I think I leave it there. Perhaps someone else wants to add.
Anybody else want to add a comment? Would the panelists like to say anything at all in relation to all of this?
I'm not being humble in saying that I'm coming here to learn. That's what I'm taking notes and paying very close attention to all your remarks. One of the things I find missing from all your remarks is the issue of collective memory. Maybe it is such an old hat, old-fashioned stuff that nobody wants to take care of it, especially when we talk about the present moment, the cities, and the urban, even the affect. As an old man, I feel strong affect, to quote Abbas, from memories, both personal and collective. And then, of course, I read literature and the theory saying that this is nothing, just a thin air, no such thing as memory. Then, of course, I see right in front of my eyes when recently in Hong Kong, an incident took place, namely with so 2 years ago, with the Star Ferry, when suddenly you have people demonstrating, whereas before they turned down all the buildings, people just don't care. But suddenly with Star Ferry, waves and waves of people, not only young, but also all kinds of people coming, including the Filipino mates who came to Hong Kong. They joined the parade, so to speak, for the first time. I asked myself, why suddenly at this moment? So here you have a conjunction of this present moment, a specific moment, and some kind of a diverse strands of memory coming up. My easy interpretation is that, of course, it's the clock. The clock on top of, it's not an old clock, it's a new clock, actually. It's really not much. And yet, people seem to, once you destroy the clock, people somehow get agitated. They have a strange feeling. Nobody can really articulate this. But they move the clock, they constructed a new clock and a new ferry, but people don't pay attention to that at all. So that, to me, marks the beginning of a new era, it seems to me, in Hong Kong's protest movement. Ever since that, in fact, the government backed down because they cannot legislate old buildings by laws only. They have to take care of the various voices. So that's why you have the kind of agitational movement now. So I'm just raising an open-ended question as to whether, when we deal with, especially when we deal with a city like Shanghai, whether we could make both horizontal and vertical connections, especially in view of some of the discussions about time. Since I was trained as a historian, I'm just obsessed with time, both as an old man and as a historian, I'm obsessed with time, and much less so with space. I think I find a lot of discussion on space, whether it's place or space, espace or lieu, whatever you want to call that. Can we mix up things a little bit and then put space into time and vice versa? I'm just throwing out more provocation, then I have to leave. I'm sorry.